Horus Heresy Legions is a big game. It has lots of factions with lots of cards and lots of different playstyles. However, sometimes certain kinds of cards and strategies just fail to deliver. In this series, I'm going to be going over some of them. I'm going to be talking about what they are supposed to do, why they fail at doing so, and how to improve them. If you want to see more of this, subscribe and leave a like so I know you guys enjoy this content. Now, let's get into today's topic. Today, our journey starts with the release of the Isthvan 5 expansion. In this expansion, we got 3 new factions: the Iron Hands, the Raven Guard, and today's topic, the Salamanders. The Salamanders brought a lot of different new mechanics to the game, like Survivor or Sacrifice. However, there were 2 cards in the original Isthvan 5 release that were a little bit different than this. These cards are Egan Gargo and Kagosi Veterans. I'm sorry if I pronounced those names wrong. Those 2 did not focus primarily on Survivor or Sacrifice, but instead had a different twist to them. Egan Gargo is a 3 energy Astartes with 3 attack and 4 health, and the rally ability to gain frontline and +1 attack if you control an infantry troop. The Kagosi Veterans are a 4 energy Astartes with 4 attack and 4 health, and the rally ability to give +1/+1 to all friendly Imperial Army troops. As you can see, both of these cards work on synergizing with infantry or Imperial Army troops, or simply Imperial Army infantry if you want to play one kind of troops to synergize with both of them. However, these were the only 2 cards with this kind of synergy, and while you were certainly going to be playing some kind of Imperial Army infantry back then, for example, the original Jubak Starsight was a very good card back then. However, having to have this kind of troop on the board just for these 2 to do something other than being stats was not a good enough reason to run them, so most people ignored them and the community kind of forgot about them. This brings us to the next step of our journey, the Galaxy in Flames expansion. In this expansion, most factions should get alternative playstyles with missions to make them more versatile. Some factions got an alternative playstyle that somewhat worked, for example the Alpha Legion doubling down on can't attack and stun, with their mission that wants the enemy not to attack. Some factions got missions that were good, but weren't really an alternative style, like the Ultramarines mission, which was literally just play Astartes. And some factions got missions that were awful. This brings us to the Salamanders mission. Now, you can probably already guess what this mission is doing. This mission focuses on a theme that has been almost forgotten by the community: the Imperial Army Infantry Synergy. The Salamanders mission requires you to have an Imperial Army Infantry at the start of your turn 6 times. The reward for this mission is the Hammer of Salvation, which gives your Warlord Resolution, give +1/+2 to friendly infantry and Astartes troops. The reward is pretty good. This can snowball out of control pretty quickly unless your opponent manages to remove your entire board every turn. So this mission doesn't seem that bad at first glance, right? Wrong. The mission itself this is not an exaggeration, it is the worst mission in the entire game, and that's not even close. All of the missions that require you to start with something in play at the start of your turn are not that good by default. Like, for example, the Imperial Fist mission or the Imperial Army mission are both not good. However, you can make decks around them that are somewhat okay, but usually you're better off just simply not running this mission. Now, for the Salamanders mission, there's another downside. Both the Imperial Army and the Imperial Fist mission, for example, focus on cards that are in their faction. So for the Imperial Army, you require Solar Auxiliary troops, which are all Imperial Army troops, so that checks out. And the Imperial Fist mission requires you to have Imperial Fist Astartes with frontline. Both of these are still relatively hard to complete, but they are doable. This mission requires you to have an Imperial Army infantry in play for 6 turns. This is incredibly hard to get, and even if you get it, you have most likely won the game 3 times at that point anyways. The only way to somewhat reliably get this done is by opening this card and Kaizu Lane, because Kaizu Lane has precognition by default, so the enemy won't be able to face bash him. And then you just have to pray that you either draw enough buff cards so he doesn't die to any burn coming his way, or the enemy just doesn't draw any burn or hard removal. However, the Galaxy and Flame expansion didn't just release a mission for each faction. They also brought a couple of other cards for each faction that also somewhat synergized with the mission requirement. For the Salamanders, we finally got more Imperial Army synergy. Now, hopefully these cards were good, right? So that you, even with the somewhat ridiculous mission requirement, could still somewhat complete it with these cards, right? Wrong again. All of the Salamanders cards were overall pretty bad, with 3 exceptions. That was Nomos Raiden, the Warlord, Disciple of the Flames, the 4-energy troop, and Mount Deathfire, which was arguably kind of broken at the time of release. But all of these cards have one thing in common, and that's that they are the only cards in the entire expansion to not focus on the mission. All of the other cards focused on the mission. So what were these cards? First of all, we got TAF 4 veterans. The 8-energy Astartes with 7 attack, 8 HP, Survivor 2, and the passive ability to gain +1/+1 at frontline when a friendly infantry dies. I don't think I need to explain why this card is bad. It's an 8-energy Astartes that does nothing when you play it, and it actively synergizes with the opponent preventing your mission. So if you have an infantry, and the opponent kills it to prevent you from getting your mission, that's the point at which this card gets buffed. Why? Why don't you make it +1/+1 at frontline passively when you control an Imperial Army infantry to prevent your opponent from stopping your mission? And even then, this card wouldn't be good and worth it. The next card that got released were the Ishvil veterans. A 6-energy Astartes with 6 health, 4 attack, frontline, and the resolution ability to give +1/+1 to all your infantry troops in play. Now, this card is better than the TAF 4 veterans, but it's still not good. It's a 6-energy troop with 4 attack and 6 health, which is ridiculously understated. Sure, it has frontline and the passive ability to buff your infantry troops by +1/+1. However, and this is something that's generally flawed with this playstyle, the Salamanders don't have any infantry in their main deck, unless you are running specifically Imperial Army infantry troops. This means that the passive ability usually won't buff a lot of things, like maybe the 1 or 2 Imperial Army infantry troops that you have on the board for the mission, but that's it. All of the other stuff that synergizes with protecting them, like for example, let's say another Ishvil or maybe a TAF 4 that already got its buff, those would benefit from this buff arguably more than the infantry, because the infantry is not there to attack anything anyways. So why buff them? Sure, you can maybe push a Kaizu Lane over 5 turns out of range for any AoE, but that's just comes down way too late. This is a 6-energy troop. So overall, while not being the worst card in the expansion, this card still was not good. The final card that got released in this expansion was Bonds of Kinship, a 3-energy tactic that says draw 1 infantry and 1 Astartes from your deck. Now, out of all the cards that got released with this Imperial Army synergy theme, this card is by far the best. It even is, outside of this, a pretty good card overall. Now, for example, let's say you were in a normal deck that wasn't focusing on the mission, you were back then maybe playing like Ambassador Melgator as your only infantry, so this card was a way to guarantee to draw Melgator. That's most likely not worth it for 3 energy, but there's still an argument to be made for this card to be played. Now, if the entire structure, the entire synergy around Imperial Army infantry troops inside this faction was better, this card would probably be one of the MVPs. However, as it is, this card simply isn't enough to carry the entire playstyle on its own. So overall, this card is sadly not seeing any play either. And that's all the cards that the Salamanders got for this playstyle. So overall, you now have, before rotation, 6 cards synergize with the Imperial Army infantry playstyle. And shockingly, I know, you can't build a deck around 6 cards. That's 12 cards if you run everything twice, and you can't even run everything twice because the mission is a legendary, so you have 11 cards in your deck that work with this. Sure, you can include some Imperial Army infantry to fill up the other slots and some draw, but that's sadly still not a good deck. And needless to say, this playstyle still didn't took off, and the Salamanders mission is, as already mentioned, the worst in the game. And we got the Drop Site Massacre expansion that rotated the baseline Salamanders set. So just like with for example, the Death Guard, which got a poison rework, which also changed the mission for them, you could maybe expect them to release some more Imperial Army synergy cards to get people to play the Galaxy in Flames expansion support, right? Wrong again. In the Drop Site Massacre release, they simply rotated out 2 of our 6 cards for this playstyle, so arguably we rotated 33% of Imperial Army synergy cards and we got 0. We now only have these 4 god-awful Imperial Army synergy cards from the Galaxy in Flames expansion in standard mode, and that's it. They simply ignored the existence of this. Now, surely if they were not going to release anything new, they could maybe change the mission to maybe work with artifacts or change any of these other cards that I mentioned to do something else, so they are still worth playing, right? Wrong again. They also ignored these cards and didn't change any of them. So now we have these 4 dead cards in the entire card pool that are simply not worth playing, except maybe Bonds of Kinship, as already mentioned, if we get another must-have infantry troop. But yeah, so overall, why is this playstyle bad? 1, we got next to no cards to support this playstyle. 2, the inherent synergy between these two factions outside of these cards is non-existent. There is no Imperial Army card that benefits from you having Salamanders, or there is also no way of getting Imperial Army infantry troops inside the faction other than Bonds of Kinship, which requires you to play them. If we compare this to something else that is similar but works, this is the Word Bearers and their Cultist synergy. The Word Bearers got a ton of cards and even a Warlord that puts in play Cultists for them to sacrifice. This works because they have easy access to Cultists and Chaos Infantry in general without having to run those kind of somewhat bad cards in their main deck unless they want to. And the cards that we still have, and let's say we're even playing Legacy maybe, all of these cards are bad, as I said. The mission requirement is too high and overall ridiculous. Ishval do next to nothing. Tafor is actively counter synergy. Bonds is nice, as I said. Egan Gargo, yeah, okay, he's arguably the second best card because he is a 3/4 for 3, which is already good. And he gains frontline, so he's actually actively contributing to the mission goal. And Kigozi is same issue as Ishval. Yeah, you buff your infantry, but that simply does nothing. All of this results in this faction and this playstyle simply being worse than Wordbearer cultists. Now that we know why all of this is bad, how could we technically improve this to be playable? Now, first of all, we need more cards. As I said, you can't build a deck around 6 cards, or at this point even 4 cards in standard mode. Simply maybe rework some of the Drop Site Massacre cards that see no play, or focus on something that's not really supported. Maybe make them focus on Imperial Army synergy. Second of all, we need cards that spawn Imperial Army troops inside the Salamanders card pool. So that we don't have to run like, I don't know, these super understated Imperial Army infantry troops that we also need to draw to get the mission done. Next, the mission requirement needs to go down significantly. Arguably, the mission requirement could be at 3 or 4, and it would still not be good at this point. Maybe if the mission would be too good at that point, maybe you could nerf the reward a little after it's like somewhat achievable, but I still don't think that's like needed. Both the high energy troops in Ishval and Tafor need a major overhaul. Arguably, you could make Ishval, first of all, have more attack, like 4 attack for 6 energy, that's laughable. Maybe make it like at least 5. and maybe make the resolution ability give +1/+1 to all your other troops if you control infantry, so that you don't buff everything, but you buff everything if you've got the infantry. Maybe, as I said, make Tafor gain the +1/+1 at frontline while you control an infantry. And maybe, and this is not really needed, but maybe you could make Bonds of Kinship like 2 energy, because 3 energy simply to draw stuff is always a little bit iffy. But I think out of all the cards that would need buffs, Bonds is the one that needs the least of them. Next up, they kind of need other benefits from having Imperial Army guys other than the mission going down by 1 tick. As I already mentioned, like stuff like Ishval or Tafor gaining passive abilities while you control infantry. Maybe some of the other cards could gain like a Relentless or a Resolution, or maybe you even have artifacts that synergize with them, like maybe like rescue pods or something that you like generate, and that maybe those could put in play like displaced civilians for you or something. Like, I don't know, Everguild, if you're watching this, please help this archetype. And also the last thing that comes to my mind that you could do is to simply remove this Imperial Army requirement for the infantry, like just infantry, and maybe add infantry cards inside the Salamanders card pool itself, like maybe even just one card, like, I don't know, rescued civilians or something that has like 0 attack and 3 health for 1 energy or something. And then you have cards that specifically spawn rescued civilians, which then get, allow you to synergize since you now have infantry, something like that. And lastly, if Everguild actually has given up on this, please just rework these 4 cards to do something else so they at least are playable. I don't think Salamanders overall need buffs at the moment. Like, Numeon is still super duper strong, but that's no excuse to have these kind of shit cards, these kinds of filler cards. Like, for example, people complained about Sons of Horus having stuff like the 3 energy Astartes that has 2 attack and 4 health and no effect at all. Like, people complained about that, but they are apparently fine with Salamanders having 4 cards that virtually do nothing except actively making your deck worse. So again, if you don't want to buff this, just remove it and make these cards do something else that maybe benefits a more niche playstyle. Maybe it doesn't need to support meta Numeon, but maybe you could like support Sacrifice so Vulcan gets an easier time having his Reckoning. I don't know. Anyways, that's it for this video. I hope you now have a more better understanding about why the Imperial Army synergy playstyle is so bad and why you never see anyone seriously running the Salamanders mission. Again, if you want to see more of this kind of content, different strategies and archetype that failed in this game, leave a like, comment, maybe something. I've got some other things I want to talk about in this already, so the next couple episodes should be covered if you want to see them. But yeah, have a great day, guys, and I'll see you guys next time.